Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
An IMF team is in Kenya to assess the impact of corruption as the country continues to face protests against alleged police violence. A year after deadly protests against tax rises and flagrant corruption, can the government tackle graft enough to make a new deal with the IMF and maintain trust with the Kenyan public?
This is not stopping until we get justice, until they listen to us, until they listen to most of the youths who actually are the largest percentage in this country.
On today's podcast, we're looking at the Kenyan government's attempts to turn its economy around in the face of protests and whether it can do a deal with the IMF that Kenyans will accept. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent, driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. Joining me this week is our East Africa Bureau Chief. That's Helen Nyambura, who's in Nairobi for us. Helen, thank you so much for joining us. So quite a lot has happened since the protests in Kenya last July that saw at least 60 people were killed, including Kenya abandoning a program with the IMF back in March. Maybe we just start here. Where is Kenya now in negotiating a new deal with the fund?
So Kenya walked away from the final review of that previous 4-year IMF program, which meant it wasn't able to draw down on about $850 million in a final disbursement. It's already requested for a new program, but talks for that will only start maybe in September, when Kenya is expected to have what's called Article 4 consultations. But there is an IMF team in town for a different process that's called a governance diagnostic. It's an exercise in which IMF staff analyze a country's governance and corruption vulnerabilities. So they come up with recommendations in a report that the government then can choose to make public or not. Something that's gained a bit of popularity in the last 8 years or so. There have been 21 such reports in different places: Haiti, Sri Lanka, Mauritania. Kenya has asked for this. It's a voluntary process. That's what the IMF team is in Kenya currently to do. The outcome of that governance diagnostic may inform negotiations for a new financing program. It may also form the conditionalities for any subsequent IMF program. So that's where Kenya is right now.
Helen, when we compare Kenya to some of the other countries you just listed there as far as corruption goes, how serious would you say the problem is in the country?
Corruption is a pretty major issue in Kenya. Some may argue it's Kenya's biggest problem, and Kenya has, a bunch of problems. Kenya ranks rather poorly on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. I think the most recent one, it was about 121 out of 180 countries, which is a pretty poor showing. So corruption in Kenya is pervasive. It's to be found everywhere. Most people will say that they ask for bribes, for treatment, to get medical treatment, or to access their pension, or to get government services. And it's not just, in public, the public sector. It's also in the private sector. So it is a really big issue in Kenya.
Which sort of leads me to this next question, Helen, about the protests that we've been seeing in Kenya. Much of the most recent ones are against the behavior of the police in Kenya. But can you talk about maybe more broadly where this reaction has come from and how we're seeing the government responding, especially considering those statistics you just pointed out?
So the protest that we saw this week and last week was sparked by the death in police custody of a digital activist. He was just 31 years old. He was a teacher in Western Kenya. He allegedly made some comments online about bribery in the police force against the second most senior police officer in the country, who then went on to make a formal complaint that led to the activist's arrest. So that alleged murder, which was just 2 weeks ago, but since then there have been about a dozen similar deaths in detention, which the police marked as suicide. And that's according to the Independent Policing Oversight Authority. With this activist's death, the police initially reported that it was a suicide in the police cell, but were forced to change this after a post-mortem showed that the injuries were actually inflicted by someone else. So that just shows you that, corruption is a big matter and people are willing to kill, to cover up. The Deputy Inspector General of Police, who made the formal complaint, has since stepped away to allow for investigations. But demonstrators on Tuesday were demanding that he be arraigned in court. Several officers that were on duty on that day have also been arrested and gone to court. But yeah, it just underscores a major issue in Kenya that, police brutality has been a long running problem in Kenya since pre-colonial times. And on Tuesday, during the protests, one policeman was seen shooting at a street vendor at point blank range, which just underscores the issue.
Absolutely. And the reaction to points to what we've heard from a lot of Gen Zers who feel a bit disillusioned by this government and this president who had made promises to tackle this when he ran for president. Stick with me, Helen. When we come back, we're going to look at what some of the efforts the government is trying to make to tackle corruption and how crucial a new deal with the IMF could be to turning the country's economy around. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Today, we're looking at efforts to tackle corruption in Kenya as the IMF begins a 2-week visit to the country. Helen Nyambura, our East Africa Bureau Chief, is still with us. So, Helen, President Ruto came into office promising to fix the economy that had been afflicted by corruption and also ineptitude. Many of these protests, though, are criticizing what he has and hasn't been able to do. What exactly has he achieved?
Most Kenyans that I've spoken to will say that President Ruto has failed to stamp out, corruption. Very high-ranking officials in his government have been implicated or linked to corruption scandals. Corruption has always been a problem in Kenya, so it's not just a problem in this government, but it seems that it's gotten worse with each subsequent government, and this one too hasn't been able to make any inroads at stamping it out.
I actually wanted to ask, what do you make of President Ruto's then response to the current situation that we're seeing on the ground there?
Yeah, he did come out with a statement saying that the killing of these activists was completely unnecessary and a sad turn of events. So to his credit, he has come out and condemned that killing.
The Independent Police Oversight Authority must make sure that officers in uniform who engage in criminal activity instead of protecting citizens must be brought to book, held to account decisively, efficiently.
But he has made comments against protests. And Tuesday's protest, we saw all these hooded people on motorbikes with whips and like batons beating at people, and they were chanting that Ruto is going to get another term and that there should be no protest. So what some Kenyans and the protesters saw that was that these were goons hired by government operatives to stamp out legitimate people's constitutional right to protest. On the other side, the government says that it is doing something about this police brutality.
Might any of this factor, Helen, into what the IMF is going to be looking at over the next few weeks?
This governance diagnostic looks at 6 state functions, and one of the state functions that it looks at is the rule of law, which, police brutality and anti-corruption would fall under. The other things it looks at is fiscal governance, central bank governance, financial sector oversight, market regulation, and anti-money laundering. So governance will probably feature in the report, but it's just one of 5 other things that they look at.
Is this potentially, though, a real test for President Ruto, especially, we've talked about how he came into power, what he, committed to doing, and really what his image has been on the global stage. I wonder if you think that this could potentially be a turning point for him, and many people will want to see how he handles this.
Yeah, I think the protests last year were what really sullied his image globally. He had been seen as this Pan-African leader, but those protests and how the government handled them, more than 60 people were killed in those demonstrations that were over about 2 months or so. That really did sully his image globally. And with this protest, I think the world will also be watching to see whether there have been any changes in the way the government handles protests, people's legitimate right to protest. And a lot of people around the world will be watching the response.
And Helen, before we let you go, considering you are in Nairobi, I wonder if you can just describe for us the feeling on the ground there now that all of these different incidences are happening. Is it palpable when you walk around? I wonder if you get a sense that the sentiment maybe has shifted on the ground there.
Yeah, with the protests last year, it was a lot of young people. But in the years since, I've seen the disquiet moving to even much older generations. So there is a palpable sense of disquiet. And although I don't think it would, degenerate into like violence, but I think many Kenyans are talking about change at the ballot box. We have elections in 2027. So a lot of people are looking for a change at those presidential elections. So there's a lot of calls for, a different leader to come in then. And we hope that if there will be any change, then it will be democratic rather than violence.
Helen Nyambura, our East Africa Bureau Chief. Helen, thank you so much for joining us this week. You can read all of our coverage on Kenya's economic challenge across Bloomberg platforms now. Here's some of the other stories from the region we've been following this week. South African inflation held steady in May as uncertainty around its outlook mounts, complicating the task for the central bank when it meets next month. And South Africa's Kyalami Grand Prix circuit is planning an overhaul costing as much as $10 million as the country prepares to submit a bid to host its first Formula One race in 3 decades. You can find these stories on Bloomberg platforms, including the Next Africa newsletter. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. This program was produced by Adrian Bradley and Tiwa Adebayo. Don't forget to follow and review this show wherever you usually get your podcasts. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thanks for listening.